Luckily, our church is back this week after being at CCCJR last weekend, which is always a cool treat because of where it is in Estes Park. I think that's a beautiful location. I'm glad that our church gets to be a part of that each year. Sorry, I always get my timer going so I don't take your entire day. But, All right. Well, it was a few years ago, back in college for me, when I was just finishing up my freshman year of college. Now, during my freshman year of college, I've gotten involved with a group called Campus Crusade. Some people know them as Crew. They're a great organization that helps students on campus get connected with each other, grow in God, sends them on missions. Well, part of this group, at the end of the year, the guys of Crew would kind of have a party, a get-together kind of thing. And I got to go be a part of it. And this was a tradition that they had going for a while. So what we would do is we'd show up at the Crew guys' house. We'd go into the backyard where they had a fire pit set up. And we'd get a bunch of those folding lawn chairs and we'd set them around this fire pit, right? You'd get the fire going in the fire pit. You'd have someone else on the side, cooking up brats and burgers. And we'd all sit around this fire pit. And right around when it starts getting dark, you take out of your backpack all the schoolwork you'd been doing all year long. One by one, you would take things out, things that are useless to you at this point. You'd show it up to the group, and they'd all get excited, and they'd be like, burn it, burn it. And you'd crumple it up, toss it in, and you just watch the flames go up. It was awesome. We'd all be sitting around this fire pit, and we'd be just chanting and having a good time and laughing. And you start out with the stuff that's really useless. You don't really need it, the syllabus for the semester for a class that you're never taking again. It's just a bunch of rules for that class. You don't need that. Toss it in. Well, eventually you ran out of syllabuses. So you start pulling out the quizzes that you got the C on. And I was like, my parents don't need to see that I got this. Toss it in. Fire goes up higher. Everyone's excited, chanting. Everyone's burning. Well, eventually you run out of those too. And now you're starting to make some choices because what you have left are notes that you probably could use again, but there's a fire right there. And you're just sitting there and, do I really need to know how to be an effective communicator? Probably not. Toss it in and everyone goes crazy and it's awesome. I don't even remember my friend Aaron. It was his house. He was the leader of the guys' Crew movement. And he was just a student just like me. He was graduating his final degree before moving on to a master's. And he walks up with a notebook. He's like, yeah, this is a notebook I bought for a class. I didn't actually ever use it. There's no notes whatsoever. It's completely empty. He just chucked the whole notebook into the fire. And we all went crazy. We loved it. It was great. The fun thing is that guy actually went on to become an accountant. So I don't think I would trust him with my finances, but he was a lot of fun to hang out with. Well, we kind of get into this habit, I think, as people, where we start throwing away and burning anything that really we don't find value in anymore. This happens in our life. My number one method for cleaning my room at home is taking a giant black trash bag and throwing as much as I can into it and then tossing it in the dumpster. We throw away things really quickly these days. It's easier to do it. It's easier to throw away stuff that we don't want to deal with. And I think that can happen with the Bible at times. This morning, I want to talk to you guys about one of the 10 Commandments that we've kind of taken, crumpled up, and tossed in the fire. We don't really deal with it because it's not something particularly pleasant to deal with. So please, if you have your Bibles, open up to Exodus. We're going to look at chapter 20. Now, if you don't have your Bibles, a lot of people have Bibles on their phones these days. that's awesome. I'd ask if you're using a Bible on your phone, go ahead and throw it in airplane mode for me. Just so that you don't, get a text and get distracted, and next thing you have no clue what I'm talking about. And yeah, if you could just do that for me, that'd be great. All right. So Exodus chapter 20, and we're going to be looking at verses 8 through 11 together. Now, when you are there, I'm going to ask all of you to become very inconvenienced for a second. Because when you found it, I would like you to stand as I read it for us. So when you have it, I'd like you to stand up so I can read it. All right. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male servant or female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that's in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Dear God, thank you so much for this reading of Scripture. I just pray that as we take our time this morning to dive into what you have to say, you would help us leave behind all of the stresses of the outside world so we can really focus on what you have for us. And as you challenge us, God, I pray that we don't close off our hearts to what you have to say to us, but we invite what you have to say and ask ourselves whether or not it's true. We thank you so much for this time that we get to celebrate you together this morning as we dive into your word. In your powerful name I pray, amen. Amen. You may be seated. So, when we're looking at God's 10 Commandments, at first glance, this one, it's like, what's this one doing here? If we're going to be honest, like the other 10 really make sense. You can expect that when God was giving these commandments to Moses, and Moses was writing it down on his rock tablets, and you should be like, yeah, do not murder, that sounds great. Ching, 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 ching. Get it in there. Do not commit adultery. Awesome, let's have that right in there. Ding, 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 ding. No stealing. Ding, 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 ding. Yeah, all's good. What's the problem? Wait a second. You want us to take a day off? You want us to not work for a day? Are you sure you want that in this list? Because, if I was arranging the Old Testament, taking a day off once a week, that doesn't seem like a top 10 kind of thing. Like, how did that make God's big list? You expect taking a day off would be somewhere back in Leviticus, next to rules about boiling baby goats and their mother's milks. Don't do it, by the way. Rules about, sideburns and what's appropriate. Back with all of those weird rules, that's where you expect this one. You don't expect it here in the top 10. I feel like we have to stop and ask ourselves this question, why was this so important to God? What made this one such a big deal that he had to include it in this list? And when we ask that question, I think we also need to ask ourselves the question, so why isn't it that important to us? Why is it that this one, out of all the 10 commandments, seems to be the one that we ignore the most? I think we need to actually think back and remember the context of this passage in Scripture. So, what had been going on to the group of Jews in the wilderness who got this commandment? See, this was before Israel was even a nation. See, the Jews had come out of Egypt where they had spent hundreds of years in slavery. Hundreds of years where, because of their Egyptian masters, they didn't have any vacation time. They didn't get weekends off. They didn't get to have lunch breaks where they hung out at the water cooler. They were coming out of that. They were going through the wilderness, and God was saying to them, I'm making you a new nation and a new people. And with that, I want to give you something. something that no other nation had, which is a day off. This was unheard of in the ancient times, among ancient civilizations, because a day off didn't make sense. Especially when your nation, as the Jews were a bunch of traveling nomads at the time who didn't even have strongholds to set up. They were constantly having to be aware of people and other groups around them that could attack them. They were constantly on the move. There were a lot of dangers, and to take a day off each week seemed to be the last thing you would want to do. But God knew that they needed a day off. In fact, when we look back at the section of verses we just covered, in verse 11, it says something kind of interesting when you think about it. It says, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." Why this is confusing is because when we think of God, we think of a being that is all-powerful. Why is a being that is all-powerful taking a day off? Did he get that tired from making things? Well, I think we have to realize that if we're going to say God is all-powerful, that doesn't go with this idea that God needs to take naps. Why did God then take the day off in the first place? I believe, based on this passage, what God was doing was he was becoming a demonstration for us. He was becoming a demonstration for us because he knew that as humans, we wanted to work all the time, naturally. If we weren't doing something, we felt like we were just kind of sitting around. We felt like we're incompetent. It's not this good feeling. Typically speaking, when you're in the mindset where you have to get ahead, you have to stay ahead, you have to be ahead. And when God takes a day off, he tells us something. And that is, no matter how important you think you are, no matter how busy you think you are, you can take a day off too. That's what God is demonstrating for us in the Sabbath here. And that's why he's wanting to make it holy, was because he knew that human beings need rest. If God thinks that us having rest is so important, how can we spend so much of our time ignoring him? Now, I know most of you don't go to work 7 days a week, and that's good. Most of you don't go to work 7 days a week. But I'm willing to bet that a lot of you who don't go to work 7 days a week still take work home with you the other 2 days. And that's the kind of the age we live in. When you're not at work, you take it home on your laptops. You have your boss who can get a hold of you 24/7 on your cell phone. When you actually stop to ask yourself how much time you were actually doing work, I bet you most people in this room would be hard-pressed to find a single day where they say that they actually took the whole day off without any kind of work. Even in our schools with our children, they go to school 5 days a week, but there are very few weekends in the year that they don't have homework that they have to do. Taking a day off is something that seems kind of foreign to us this day and age. We don't rest, and ultimately a lot of us choose not to rest, and we say that this commandment really isn't that big a deal because of what we know comes later in the New Testament. We say because of what the New Testament says later, we actually don't really need to rest anymore. What I want us to do is actually take some time this morning to go to the New Testament to look at the reason that we try and use the New Testament to say we don't need a Sabbath. So please, if you would, turn your Bibles, flip it all the way over to Mark. Mark is the second book in the New Testament, right after Matthew. If you hit Revelation, you've gone too far. And we're going to look at chapter 2, at a story of Jesus, and where he talks about the Sabbath itself. All right, when you're there. So, Mark chapter 2, we're going to look at, starting in verse 23, and I'll read it for you. One Sabbath, he, Jesus, was going through the grain fields, and they made their way, they, the disciples, their way. As they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Pause. Why is this not lawful? The Sabbath says we're not supposed to work one day a week. So what's the problem with the disciples plucking grain from the field, from the heads of the stock? Well, I'm glad you guys asked. See, in the Old Testament, following the Sabbath was a big deal. If you didn't actually follow the Sabbath, the punishment, according to the Old Testament, was death. I know, that's kind of a bit harsh. You would actually get stoned, and not in the Colorado sense. You would get stoned because people would throw rocks at you till you stopped living. That was the punishment for breaking the Sabbath. So what the Pharisees did was they said, all right, if we're going to avoid breaking the Sabbath accidentally, we need to set up some rules and define what this thing work is. What is work? So that we make sure that we don't do work. And that's where the Pharisees came up with something called the oral law. Now, concerning the Sabbath, they made 39 rules to define what work was. And their intention was good. Their intention was to say, if touching that flower pot is breaking the Sabbath, we want to make sure that you can't go past the podium here. They wanted to set kind of a distance, a barrier, so that people wouldn't go too far. So they start making these rules, and the 39 rules to define work. Out of those 39, the disciples walking through a grain field and picking grain to eat, that broke 4 of the rules. 4 of their rules for their oral law. So that's where they're coming at Jesus saying, here your disciples are breaking the Sabbath. And this is how Jesus chooses to respond. He says to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he also gave it to those who were with him." So here's this story about David that Jesus is using. Now, David is a great example throughout the Old Testament of someone who people look up to, who a lot of times what he did, it kind of sets precedences. And I don't have time to unpack this story this morning, but I want to give you the gist, the big idea of what Jesus is getting at with this story. And that is exactly what he says next. His big idea is this. Starting in verse 27. "And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." The Sabbath is made for man. What the Pharisees were choosing to do was they were choosing to become slaves to the Sabbath. And making all these rules that went beyond what the Sabbath was, they were choosing to put the Sabbath in a position where they were slaves, where they had to obey it at all costs all the time, and they stopped seeing the Sabbath for what it really was. And that was a gift to them. The Sabbath was a gift to the Israelites, and Jesus knew that. He knew the purpose of it, and that's where he says it's the Sabbath was not made for man. And that's I think we agree with him, and we say, yeah, we don't want to be slaves to the Sabbath. But now today, I feel like we've gone too far the other way, and we've thrown it out altogether. We don't want to be slaves to the Sabbath because it's too inconvenient, so let's just throw it out. And we're throwing out this gift that God has given us. And it's because, we think about not working for a day, and it's actually kind of hard, and which makes no sense, because how could not working be the hard thing, right? Not working should be easy. But the problem is, we've decided to believe a lie. We've decided to believe a lie. And here's the lie. If we don't work all the time, we will fall behind. If we don't work all the time, we will fall behind. That's the lie. Sometimes you hear it said as, if we take time off, the rest of the world's going to pass us. If we won't work, if we don't work all the time, then our needs aren't going to get provided for. When it comes to the Sabbath, it seems at first glance that we have a hearing problem about the idea that Jesus wasn't getting rid of it. When in reality, we have a heart problem. And some of us still are uptight because we have this thought, well, the Sabbath is the law. We don't need to follow the law because we have Jesus' grace. Well, I want to talk about that too. So, if you'll do me a favor, we're just going to turn a few pages over to Romans, which comes right after Acts. And we're only going to be there briefly, so if you don't feel comfortable trying to get there in time, that's fine. You don't have to race to get over there. But in Romans 13, we get this passage where Paul is trying to talk to a fractured church full of both Christian Jews and Gentile Christians. I said that wrong. Yeah. Christian Jews, Gentile Christians. Oh, I said it right. Oh, fine. All right. He's talking to this group, and they're debating about which day it is. They say, one's saying it has to be on Saturday, the other group's saying it has to be on Sunday. Well, in 13:5-6, we read, Sorry, 13:5-6. Therefore, one must be subjected not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes for the authorities and are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Sorry, that's on taxes. Oh, my bad. Chapter 14. Oof. One person esteems one day as better than the other, while the other esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in the honor of the Lord. The one who eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while one who abstains in honor of God and gives thanks to God. I know that section sounds confusing, but what Paul is saying is, when you pick which day to honor the Sabbath, you're doing so for God. You're doing so in response to him as a gift. You're not doing so because you're under law and have to do it a certain day. So what Paul is saying is it doesn't matter what day you Sabbath on. Oftentimes what we hear is that it doesn't matter to Sabbath if it's inconvenient. I think sometimes it's wise if we look at Sabbath kind of like how we look at fasting or worship. Fasting. Think about it this way. Is fasting essential for Christian living? This question is asked a lot in the Bible. Well, we know quite a few things about fasting, but when it comes down to it, while fasting is essential for our relationship with God, no one else decides when we have to fast. No one else decides what we have to fast from. Fasting is actually another example of something God has given us so that we can have a deeper relationship with Him. That's what Sabbathing is like as well. When we Sabbath, no one else decides how you have to rest. No one else decides when you have to rest. But it still is essential for your living and your relationship with God for you to choose a time to do that with Him. And we look at worship. Now, we call this worship where we show up on Sundays, but I'm talking more of actually when we're worshiping God, singing to Him. How awkward would it be if I walked into the room and all right guys, if you're not worshiping with this hand up here, maybe this hand right about there, with your head bowed, then you're not doing it right. In fact, if you try and go for any notes that are out of your range, you are not worshiping God correctly. You need to refrain from worshiping God that way. It'd be ridiculous. Now, that is what the Pharisees were saying. In their oral law, they were making such high rules about the Sabbath that would be like as if someone came in and said, this is the only way you can worship God. There is no other ways. And that's just not the case. When it comes to Sabbath, it's like worship in the sense that it's essential for your relationship with God, but you are free to do it as you want. You are free to express that relationship and receive that gift as you want. So what makes it so hard to do? What makes it so hard when we're told that there's not specific rules on it? Why is it so hard for us to actually take time and do it? It's when we start believing those lies that if we take time off, God will provide for us. It's actually a failure on our part to trust God. And Israel had that same issue. I know we're jumping a lot this morning, but I want you to go back to Exodus. We're going to look at a few chapters earlier at Exodus 16. This is the first time God brings up the idea of Sabbath for the Jews. So we're going to go to Exodus 16. Because now that we know our issue is trusting God, let's see how it was hard for them and see what we can get out of that. Starting in verse 1, they, the Jews, set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. On the 15th day of the second month, after they had departed from the land of Egypt, the whole congregation of people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into a wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. So here's what's going on. The Jews had just gotten out of Egypt. They had just gotten freed from Egypt, and all the food they had brought with them had run out. So here they are in the middle of the wilderness without any food, and they're following Aaron and Moses. And we like to give the Jews a lot of hard times in church. Like we like look at the way they grumble and say, man, I can't believe they'd be so grumbling against God after he did this and this and this for them. But if we're honest for ourselves, how much do you guys grumble when you've gone too long without food? For me, it's quite a while, actually. I mean, like, if I go without food, my grumbling will be endless. I'll just be so agitated with everyone. I'll hardly be able to think. I'm just like thinking ahead about what can I have for food. Maybe some of you are this way already, thinking about lunch. I don't know. But when you go without food for a while, it's kind of hard to not be grumbling and upset. And what they're saying here is, Moses, why'd you bring us out here? We would have enjoyed our deaths a lot more with full bellies back in Egypt than being dragged all the way out here to starve to death. So that's the situation they're in. And it's not, I'm sure Moses is kind of freaking out, so he goes to talk to God. And it says, then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I am about to make it rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. So this is what God's going to do. He is going to make literally bread rain from heaven. He's going to give them food. But he's doing so while testing them. What is the test? On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, At evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumblings against the Lord. For what are we that you grumble against us? And Moses said, when the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to be full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, that you grumbled against him, what are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord. So Moses is like, you've been grumbling against us. You're going to see that you're grumbling actually against God, because tonight God is going to send us meat. Tomorrow God is sending us bread. In the evening, quail came up and covered the camp. In the morning, dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like, fine as frost on the ground. When people saw it, they said to another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is bread from the Lord has given you to eat. So here they have been hungering. They are in the wilderness. God is going to miraculously give them food. What's the test? Here's the test. It's only for each portion for the day. In fact, the original translations, it might be in your Bible, says manna. Manna in Hebrew actually means portion. So God is going to give them enough food for each day. Well, here's what's going to happen. They're going to go out each day and collect food and eat it for that day. But they are not allowed to collect any extra food for the next day. And some of them, though, don't believe God, and they do it anyways. They collect food for the next day. And the next morning, when they look at the extra food that they had set aside, it's full of maggots and it's gone rotten. It's no longer any good to eat. And this happens every single day of the food of the previous day. So you're not supposed to save food. Well, except for on day 6. And here's why. Because on the last day, the Sabbath day, God didn't want people having to work to make food or collect these things. He wanted them to take the day off. So what God said was on day 6, you're supposed to collect twice as much so that you have some for the next day. After your food has become maggots every single day for a week, it's hard to trust that on the 6th day, you're actually going to still have good food by the next morning. When God set up the Sabbath, the test was whether or not people were going to trust him to provide each day, and that the provision on the 6th day would last an extra day. That's really the key to Sabbath. Because when we look at Sabbath as this awesome way that we can connect with God through a gift, we can't actually take in that gift if we're not willing to trust him. If you're trying to work all the time, you kind of have, it's like you have your hands gripped so tightly around your time. You won't let it go. It's your time. If you need to get something done, then it's your right to get something done. You have to work all the time. You have a life. You have to provide for your family. You have schoolwork that has to get done all the time. And it's like you have your fists tight around your time. And the only way you're going to be able to get God's gift of rest is when you can trust him enough to open your hands and give that time to him so that you can rest. It doesn't matter which day you pick. It doesn't matter how you want to rest. When we ask, what is work that I'm not supposed to do? You know what work is. You can define what your life is like and what your work is. If you can ask yourself, is this work? And you pretty much know instinctively whether or not what you are doing is work or not. And when you actually take a whole day where you can say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do this work. You're taking a day and letting your hands open to trust God. And through that relationship, through that gift, you're going to have a much deeper relationship with God, because you'll realize that your trust is well placed and that you're getting the rest that you need for the rest of your life, for the busy and crazy seasons. When it comes down to it, this gift from God of Sabbath is ours for the taking when we can trust him. Now, some of you might need something more concrete to hold on to before leaving today. I want to give you some actual application as far as things I have found that are really useful when it comes to trying to make sure I get the most out of this gift. So these are my tips. By no means do you have to follow these. By no means is this like the law of the only way to do Sabbath, because I already told you that's not the case. But these are my tips that will help you get the most out of get this chance to rest in God. Number one, your Sabbath should be scheduled in advance. You should look at your calendar and pick a time ahead of time to set aside the day that you're going to rest in God. And why do I say that? Because if you're anything like me, you have an open schedule, and as soon as people contact you, you fill up every possible slot throughout your week. And by the end of the week, you'll realize you actually never set aside a time to rest in God. You'll try and set aside like an hour or something, and you just won't get the full rest that you wanted. If you schedule out in advance when you want to take your Sabbath and block the day off, when people ask you if you're free that day to do something for them, some type of work, something you don't want to do, you say, no, that's my day off. I'm not putting anything on that day. That day is my day to rest. And you need to schedule it out in advance, because if you don't plan for that, you're not going to end up actually taking the Sabbath and getting the best out of that gift. Number two, this is my advice. To the best of your ability, disconnect from your phone. It used to be the case that there were certain jobs that were on-call jobs. Doctors, lawyers. My mom was a physical therapist, so I remember for a while, you had what was called a pager. I don't know if anyone remembers the pager, little black box and whatnot. People would call it and get a hold of you. But here's the thing about the pager. You knew when you were on call, and only a select number of people knew the number so that they could get a hold of you when you had your time off, if they needed you to come do something. Well, nowadays we don't have the pager. We have this thing where anyone, anywhere can get a hold of us at any time. It's kind of like we're all living lives where we're on call nonstop, where everything we do people can get a hold of us no matter where we go, Your boss gets a hold of you, asks for more than you can give. You have so many people who want to get a hold of you. Everyone has access to you all the time as long as you have this going. And that is going to eat away at the times when you are trying to rest in God. Because it's really hard to rest in God when you have a million work emails you have to answer. It's really hard to do that. We get distracted really easy. You're not going to get the most out of your rest. Now, I still need my phone. There are things that, times before or after I'm resting when I need to get a hold of people. I like to have my phone because I put my audiobooks on my phone so I can listen to audiobooks. So what I do is I actually put my phone in airplane mode when I want my time with God that's uninterrupted. I take my phone, put it on airplane mode, pretend I'm going on a flight for a few hours. The world won't end in those hours while I'm away. And I actually have a chance where I can rest with God. The world is not going to end if people can't get a hold of you for a little while. If God could take a day off, then you are not too important that you can't take a day off either. And the last one, number 3, is respect other people's Sabbath so that they will respect yours. If someone else is taking a Sabbath, don't assume that that's your free time where you can get them to do what you want them to do. That's actually, when we looked at the commandment, right in the middle, verse 10, we kind of skimmed over it. It said, you're not to do a Sabbath. You Your sons, your daughters, that they need to do a Sabbath. Your male, your female servants, even your livestock. Even the foreign person who lives in your field who is not Jewish is not allowed to work on Sabbath. That's what verse 10 in chapter 20 was talking about in Exodus, is actually respecting other people's Sabbath as well. Because it's kind of also one of those areas where we can cheat. If we can get other people to do work for us, we don't really have to trust God if other people are taking care of it on our Sabbath. We need to trust God, and we also need to respect other people's Sabbath. It's still an act of trusting God to respect their Sabbath, and then also in trusting God and respecting their Sabbath, they will respect your no when they ask you to do something on your Sabbath. I want you guys to think for a second, and I want you to imagine what this all looks like. This has been it's a really practical kind of idea about what it means to have a Sabbath, but in reality, this is another building block, like fasting, like worship, where we get to take time and actually celebrate that God has given us the gift of rest. And it will deepen our relationship with Him when we do that. I want you all to imagine a jigsaw puzzle for a second. I know that's odd, but imagine it. You're trying to put it together. You start with the corners, because those are always the easiest to find. You build your sides. You find the colors that make sense, and you start getting really invested in this thing. You can't imagine how amazing it'll look when it's done. You feel this satisfaction as you're going, and it's very satisfying, fulfilling every piece you put in there. And then imagine you get to the last piece and it's not there. And all this work, all this frustration towards what would have been a very satisfying conclusion kind of gets left behind. And that's what happens in our Christian lives when we throw the Sabbath away. We miss out on a gift God gave us, that God has given us for our satisfaction to help fulfill our lives. Don't throw it away because it's inconvenient. Don't be a slave to it, but embrace it for what it is, a gift. Dear God, thank you so much for letting us get to come here today